Sam Hazledine, and I'm here with Dr. Henry Kurtz to talk about burnout. Now, burnout is, as you will know, a huge issue facing our profession. And so we're going to split this into two parts. Firstly, we're going to talk about identification of burnout. And secondly, we're going to talk about what we actually do if we find ourselves in burnout. We also have an additional episode with a psychologist to go deep into addressing the mind components of recovery, because that's so important. When I began researching doctor wellbeing and burnout back prior to 2010, initially I was concerned, shocked even, to find that rates of burnout were 1 in 2 doctors. And I was even more concerned when I tied that burnout to depersonalization, an emotional disconnection from our patients. And that depersonalization tied that to patient harm. Now, for me, it was shocking to put some data around the fact that the way we were being, the way we were living and working as doctors was harming our patients. Now, I used to call it medicine's dirty little secret, because it was a sort of thing that we knew about, but we didn't really talk about, but there's nothing secret about it now. And the rates of burnout have in fact increased to 2 in 3 doctors. So this is a real problem. Dr. Henry Kurtz is a PGY7 doctor who personally himself went through burnout during the northern New South Wales mega floods in 2022. His journey through burnout led him to finding meaning in his recovery and in fact going on to establish Wombat, which among other things offers psychological services to doctors going through burnout. So there's really no better person than Henry to talk about this today. Welcome, Henry.
Thanks so much, Sam. It's great to be here, and yeah, congrats on this series. I think it's going to really have a massive impact for a lot of doctors out there, so excited to be a part of it.
Oh, it's brilliant to have you here. Hey, Henry, just before we get into the content today, do you want to just share a little bit about your journey through burnout?
I would say it's not a particularly unique journey. I think it's something that is probably mirrored by hundreds, if not thousands of doctors, like particularly in the region and particularly as a consequence of the floods. But I guess I've just been maybe a little bit more vulnerable and transparent about sharing my story, which I didn't even think of, but other people have kind of fed that back to me as being useful. So I think that my journey is experienced by thousands of people, but it's, I guess, good to be able to get out there in the public and talk about it. I think essentially what happened for me was, I spent the first few years of my career, going pretty well. I was like low community bid. I was working as a sort of emergency resident registrar, really surfing, traveling, having a pretty laid back existence, and everything was going really wonderfully. And then there was kind of like a series of unfortunate events that occurred in my life. I won't go through all of them, but they kind of reached a pinnacle during the Lismore floods. And so I was going from this like pretty idyllic existence of traveling, low commune, having a great life, going through a series of unfortunate events, and then finding myself in this kind of apocalyptic landscape, which was the Lismore floods. And I think it's almost like there was this state of emotional numbness that I entered into that prevented me from seeing my environment for what it is, but also that blocked me from recognizing the things that were going on internally. So essentially, after COVID and then the floods, there was this very, I guess, heightened state where I was both heightened and numb, which was quite a weird feeling to experience, because you're a bit nervous, you're a bit anxious, but you're also feeling numb as well. So unfortunately for me, and I think probably for many people as well, that kind of trajectory eventually led to like a tipping point. And I think we're going to talk about tipping points later on. And I was driving home from work one day and just had a massive unexpected panic attack. It almost felt like I was hit by a truck. So I pulled over and called one of my friends who was a GP in the area, and went over to his house and kind of laid it all out and realized how much stress and damage had been done to my nervous system. So yeah, I think really the difficult thing was and we're going to talk about it later as well, realizing how difficult it is to have insight into your own mental health sometimes. particularly when it comes to burnout, because, you know, doctors tend to, you know, like stress and adversity and adrenaline. We always thought it was part of the package, you know, but it can have a very insidious toll, and that toll might catch up to you at some point in a way that you're not prepared for. But that was, in a nutshell, basically my story. And then, yeah, there was a recovery phase after that we can talk about later.
And we are going to talk about that. Yeah, thank you. I think that's why we split this into two. This first one is purely about identification because it is so difficult. You know, I personally have been through burnout as well. And you know, I think my case was such that I wasn't as quick as you, Henry, to identify it, and subsequently it took me a lot longer to recover from it. You know, I left it so long that for me it developed into a chronic fatigue syndrome, which was really tough to overcome. And ultimately I did by addressing the mind component more effectively. But, you know, the longer you leave it, the tougher it gets. So today, you know, the goal in this first episode is really to equip the listener, watcher, however you're consuming this, with the tools for early identification. Because the earlier we get to it, the easier it is to address. And in the next episode, we're going to equip you with what to do about it if you are in an early phase or a late phase. Then we actually have an additional episode where one of Henry's psychologists, a woman named Kate, who specializes in helping doctors get through burnout, will take us through a session to address the mind component of burnout, because that's such an important part. So, you know, I think that's something that I think as listeners, you're going to really enjoy. Now, you know, if 2 in 3 doctors have burnout at any point in time, then there's a good chance that if you're listening to this, you know, this is relevant to you, whether you are in burnout or at some point, there's a good chance that you'll personally experience it. I was talking with a friend of mine, Dr. Sam Prince, who's an Australian doctor, and he posed a really interesting question to me, which got me thinking. You know, he said, is it almost inevitable for passionate people like doctors to throw themselves in so deep that they burn out? And I don't have an answer for that. I don't know if it's inevitable. Possibly it is. Possibly, you know, we can avoid it. But I think what definitely isn't inevitable is that we don't have to not identify it, and we don't have to go deeper and deeper and deeper than we need to. So, you know, we are in a challenging profession. We are in a profession where the systemic issues are driving, us into burnout. We're not going to talk about changing the systemic things or the drivers of burnout today, because that's beyond the scope of this. But what we are going to talk about is how to identify it yourself and what you can do about it. So, you know, Henry, we were preparing for this and talking about it earlier, and I thought a really interesting observation you had was the changes that you see between medical students and even doctors who are PGY1. Can you talk us through that? Talk us through the changes once we start work.
Well, I was just going to make one note there, which I think is really important that you touched on. Is like, I think that I agree with Sam's comment. In general, I think that what we probably need to come up with as a broader solution is really early identification and diversion, because burnout's often a sign of, can often be a sign of things going really well in your life. I mean, you had this big successful company and you got really burnt out. And I mean, I think that it's not just adversity and stress that can lead to burnout. It could also be you're in a great relationship and you have a kid and you've got a job that's going really well. And I think that burnout can be a consequence of things going bad or well, but it's sort of an overwhelming amount of things going on, particularly if the content is really stressful. But it shouldn't be something which goes unchecked for years, because that's when it sort of starts to take its toll. So I think if medical schools or universities were more vigilant about educating people about what it looks like and how to divert yourself away, then we would be able to prevent most of the harm that occurs as a result of it. Because both of us kind of experienced this I'm invincible mentality, and then it caught up with us later. Whereas if there were ways, even through technology, to aggressively detect people who are going down a certain route, it might only be one or 2 months of correction and that they're back in a good path. So to continue on from that, I think your question was about identifying sort of signs.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and initially it's like the observation that you see from a medical student, what happens when they become doctors? Because it just seems that so many seem to lose their spark, don't they?
You can see that progression almost within the first year. And I'm sure a lot of interns, would resonate with this idea. Like there's the kind of like, you finish medical school, a hype, excitement, you're high, you're just so excited to be getting into work, and then there's that nervous energy in the first few months. I think in a way it's less maybe overwhelming than it is maybe perhaps more exciting. And then I think once that you realize the burden of the workload and the emotional inputs and the stresses of shifts and stuff starts to kick in, that maybe even towards the end of the first year, there's probably some signs creeping in. I mean, it's probably different for everybody, but I'm sure that everybody in their first year of internship has experienced signs or symptoms of burnout. And I think another point I just wanted to make quickly is like, we shouldn't think of burnout as like an on and off switch. It's not like you're doing well, you're burnt out. You're doing well, you're burnt out. Like you're going to experience a spectrum of symptoms, and it might be you're heading towards burnout, you go to Bali for a month, you come back, things are better, and then 2 months later you get some more symptoms again. But it's not just going to be all good and then all bad. And I think particularly in those early years of medicine, it's definitely good to have some red flags or some signs. And I think I just want to share one that I heard a few years ago that really stuck with me, and we talked about it before, which was if you're experiencing like unexplained like tension or heightened emotional states outside of work, particularly very high levels of frustration or anger that can't really be pinned down to sort of tangible cause and effect. That's something that I think resonates with a lot of people. The example would just be someone cuts you off in traffic and your anger is just, or your frustration is just so high. So I think if benign things outside of work are causing you to experience very heightened, unexplained states of anger, frustration, or sadness, that's one which I think is quite subtle. Technically, the definition of burnout is not a sort of psychologically defined entity like depression or anxiety, but it is characterized by three things, which is exhaustion, depersonalization, and feeling inefficient or ineffective at your job. So I think, exhaustion is one that most people, particularly junior doctors, are going to feel. I think depersonalization is like perhaps more of a subtle one, and maybe one of the signs that can easily be overlooked.
And how would someone know if they're experiencing depersonalization?
That's a great question, and I was actually thinking about it before the interview, trying to find a way to express it. Have you experienced it ever? Did you experience that component of it?
So my experience of burnout was, and this is why it's so difficult. I understand how difficult it is to identify. I was doing research into burnout. I was an advocate for doctors and doctor well-being. And so you'd consider me an expert in the space. And over time, I just started, feeling a bit more tired, not being so excited about it, not caring as much. And I remember the moment when, it was with my ex-wife, Claire, we were with our children. We were out with the kids, and she took out a digital camera. It was, back in those days, you didn't have them on the phone. And took a photo of me, and I was like, why did you take a photo? And she's like, because you look like shit. And I was like, excuse me, what? And she goes, look, you put so much into your work, you put so much into your kids, but you really leave nothing for yourself. And that was a catalyst for me to go, well, I kind of know about burnout. Maybe I should go and, take one of the assessments. And I was at the extreme end off the chart. And so that's why I understand how difficult it is to identify. You can be an expert in the space and living and breathing it every single day and still just think, oh, I'm working too hard, I'm a bit tired, I'm not caring so much. not feeling like I'm making as much progress, but that's to be expected because it's a tough job. Like it comes on so gradually, as you say, it's not on and off. It comes on slowly. And that insidious nature of it coming on makes it really difficult to identify. For me, it did anyway. And most people and doctors will understand those three things: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, a reduced sense of personal accomplishment. But it's very hard to see the picture for the frame of the picture. It's hard to actually see the picture if you're already in there.
There is some research that looks at people who work in environments where they experience a lot of emotional dissonance, which is where they are exposed to really, for lack of a better word, maybe traumatic or emotionally charged situations, but they're expected to be non-reactive, tend to experience higher degrees of burnout. So medicine's obviously a perfect example of that. You might be witness to something very traumatic in hospital, and most of the people in the room are kind of looking to you for stability, calmness, and neutrality. But you might not be feeling that inside at all. And when you experience emotional dissonance every single day of your work week, or for 4 or 5 years in a row, without opportunities to debrief with a psychologist or let it out, that's how I believe the depersonalization component really comes to life, because it's been exhausted and ineffective. It's kind of more logically found, it's just like, you're not sleeping well, you're not exercising, you're not eating well, you're not treating yourself well, you're doing shift work, you're going to get tired. And when you're tired and you're doing all those things, your cognitive efforts and your work efficiency is going to drop. But I think the depersonalization cynicism component, I think, really comes to life through that emotional dissonance mechanism that we spoke about, which creates almost like a fracture inside people, because I think that it's not a big problem if doctors are experiencing emotionally charged situations where they need to remain in control and neutral. But the big question is, how are you letting that information out? When you're witness to something stressful or overwhelming, are you bottling it up? Or are you having a cry every now and then? Are you taking it to your therapist? Are you debriefing with your partner every now and then? I think that is something that I wish I understood earlier on. And I've had a few experiences in my career where things were very overwhelming, but I never examined them or reflected on them. And I think they just got bottled up. And that's the road to numbness, because if you're not processing or debriefing on things which are inherently stressful or emotional, you're going to develop that numb feeling over time.
That's such an interesting point, because I loved the point earlier where burnout can come from a series of bad events, but it can also come from a series of really good events. And it's almost like, as doctors, as medical students, as junior doctors, we're training ourselves to project an image. And we're training ourselves to look cool under pressure, whether we're feeling it or not. We're training ourselves to, be calm in the face of, everything going wrong for a patient or whatever. And almost that acting, which it is, when you're a junior doctor, because you certainly aren't feeling calm, most of us, that acting almost starts to manifest in what we call depersonalization. Looking cool when you're not feeling it. Eventually, at some point, as you say, if you don't let it out, if you don't process it, at some point it's either going to come exploding out, or it's going to become so internalized that we retract from it. And so let's talk about that. I think it's such a, is burnout inevitable? Well, possibly not if you actually deal with that stuff in a healthy way, and deal with it when it's early. So let's talk about the signs. Let's talk about early signs of burnout. Let's talk about late signs. But let's start with the early signs, because the whole goal of this series is How can you head things off at the pass? How can we create a better generation of doctors who aren't going deep into burnout like we all have? There's got to be a better way. So let's talk about what are some of those early signs of burnout that someone might be starting to notice. Red flags.
One last point I want to make is that the inability to have insight into your burnout is probably directly correlated to how depersonalized and numb you are. Because if you're numb to your situation and your circumstances, you're going to be numb to what's going on. And I think but if you're tired and ineffective, it'll probably manifest, and people might even talk to you about it. They'll be like, hey, I noticed you're falling behind with your discharge summaries, or hey, you look exhausted, is everything okay? But the depersonalization and the numbness, I think, to me, are the kind of almost like key to getting insight and to not going down a long road. So that's just one thing I want to say.
It's a really good point. The nature of burnout itself makes it hard to see it in yourself.
I think one thing we talked about previously in preparation for this was that the signs can be extremely subtle, not to scare people, but like they can be really subtle. They can be non-textbook, and they can be almost sort of sub-perceptible, like for a while. And they're different for everybody too. So like that example I gave before, getting incredibly out of control, frustrated in traffic is one person's red flag. Another person's red flag might be sexual dysfunction or lack of intimacy in their relationship. Another one, might just be loss of interest in hobbies or just kind of emotional numbness. But my point is there's so many different possible manifestations of burnout that you just have to, the most important thing is to develop self-awareness and to avoid emotional numbness.
If someone's listening, understanding the trap of the numbness means I don't necessarily see it in myself, combined with awareness to go, something's changed. Really, that's what it is. It's like something's changed in me that I don't really like. As you say, whether it's sexual dysfunction, whether it's anger, whether it's just having less patience with your kids, whatever it is. But it's a change is an early warning sign, essentially.
I think so for sure. And I think it's, I guess we can talk about some more simpler signs as well. I think for me, it was, exhaustion and fatigue and emotional fatigue are very, very, they weren't necessarily signs for me, but for many people, that's an important one. I think particularly when thinking about work, like for example, if you wake up in the morning and the first thought you have is like, I can't do it anymore. Your first thought is like kind of despair that you can't do it. You can't go to work. You don't have the energy. You don't have the ability to do that. That's, a pretty clear one. And I think as well, if you think about bookends of your shift, if you're coming home from a shift and you have zero physical or emotional energy to do anything that's of nourishment to you, whether it's have dinner with your partner or go for a run or watch a movie, if you're if you have pre-shift kind of doom feelings about like, I don't have the energy to do this, or if you're post-shift, I can't do anything else at all, particularly if it's not just like you're doing 2 ICU shifts a week, but it's more like 4 or 5 shifts a week, that's a definite sign that like things are not going well. Another, common one that probably particularly stems from sleep problems and fatigue would be making sort of unforced errors or like clinical errors, or people picking you up on certain things, mistakes that you've been making that you wouldn't have seen yourself. And I think that's probably one as well that I guess comes up early on too. As well as, I think cynicism is technically one of the 3 criteria, and I think cynicism is like kind of the beast that fuels burnout. And you see, I've seen it, there's kind of this early dark humor cynicism that you see, and then there's kind of this kind of you've been in the hospital for 30 years, like deep cynicism. That's also kind of, there's a lot of, like, doctors have a lot of dark humor, as you know, Sam. But I think that we use cynicism as a tool to survive, but we're actually just perpetuating the problem. And I remember there's a nurse who works in a hospital that I work in locally. And whenever I see him, I'm like, how are you going? And he has this catchphrase, which is like, living the dream, like another day in paradise. And that's his like cynical, sarcastic, way of potentially, coping with all the shit that he's dealt with over the 20, 30 years he's been a nurse. And I think, so if you notice in yourself this cynicism, even if it's mixed in with humor, but it's still a cynical direction, it's not like you can't have sarcasm or, be cynical or pissed off about your life situation. But if you start to notice that popping its head more often than it used to, that's a potential early sign as well.
What's interesting is, as we talk about this, a lot of the early signs of burnout are just normalized behavior in healthcare, aren't they? Cynical humor, can't, that feeling, I can't, got to drag myself out of bed, like, it's just all part of the job. And, a lot of it stems from that, we've just got, that idea of that paradigm that we've just got to keep going for the patient. The patient comes first and everything else comes second. And that, feeds all these things. And so if you leave these early things, which a lot of people hearing them might go, that just sounds like a normal day in paradise, as that nurse might say. But, that just sounds like a normal day in paradise. What are some of the more later signs? Like, where does this go?
Look, as we said, everyone's experience is different, so I can just share my own. It might be useful for some people, but I think that there's a certain phase where burnout starts to manifest very physically. So, and beyond the effect of, like, the immediate effects of, like, the shift itself, because obviously, let's say a 10-hour shift in hospital, it's going to have, understandably, you're probably going to be tired after that, emotionally and physically, and that's not really a problem. That's kind of to be expected, right? But I think if you have taken two weeks off hospital and you're still having physical symptoms, that means that burnout's kind of gotten into your bones a little bit. And I think that for me, when I was feeling like pretty overwhelmed with the floods, and then I took some time off work, I was completely unready for how big the physical impact was. So one symptom for myself was like a sense of like feeling physically restless. So I was driving through a disaster zone, working in a COVID hospital, and then driving through a disaster zone home for 45 minutes each way. And that just went on repeat for a really long time. And so when I did stop and take some time off work, I just had so much emotional, physical restlessness. And I think that has a massive amount of knock-on effects. It means that you're not able to be present with someone in a conversation. You can't sit through a film. You always want to, keep moving. So I think that a physical restlessness or other physical symptoms, such as indigestion problems or weight gain or difficulty with intimacy. Like, we just did a burnout webinar, and I think the poll results were pretty interesting. Like, I think probably the most common physical symptom people experience was like restlessness, shallow breathing, sleep difficulties, weight gain, digestive problems. And a lot of these people were long-term healthcare workers. So I think that none of these are in the definition for burnout, which is probably an indication of burnout needing to be a DSM recognized condition. So the physical symptoms are a big one. And as well as you experience with chronic fatigue, they can have a substantial impact and might take months or years to fully recover from, which is why it's so valuable to identify and divert. But I think as well, a couple of other late signs, I guess, would be thinking about quitting medicine. It's obviously not going to happen early on, but there's going to be a sense of despondence and like, should I even do this at all? And so, yeah, I think they're probably the two main ones, is like questioning your career, and probably the physical manifestations would be pretty significant signs that you're in the deep end there.
I think it's such a great point. When you're in a bad state, you're often asking the wrong question. Should I be in medicine is not the right question. Why? The question is, why am I questioning whether I should be in medicine? So you've got to take it a step further, isn't it? And I really like the way you've got these early signs, and we've got to look at what's normal and abnormal. Normal is I'm tired, I've had a big week, but I had a good week. I have a good weekend, I have some sleep-ins, catch up, I'm feeling good again on Monday. That's normal. Or even, I took a week holiday and I'm feeling great again. But when it starts to become abnormal is, okay, I've just had a very relaxing weekend and I'm still tired. I'm still not looking forward to work. We start to look at it and go, okay, this becomes somewhat abnormal. As you say, the longer you leave it, the more chronic it becomes. And, I've talked to doctors, who it manifests, and, chronic fatigue is common, chronic pain. There's all sorts of chronic things that come from living in that stress state. And for me, it was chronic fatigue. And, the problem with, leaving something like burnout so long that it becomes chronic, chronic illness feeds itself, because you start looking for, you start scanning your body for tiredness or whatever. And so, for me, it was the mindset component that had to be addressed to effectively address the fatigue component, which lasted for years for me. So, I think, I think to people listening have, as you say, the textbook definition is one thing. The reality of manifestation of this in doctors is quite different. And, it ranging from, slightly different emotional or physical responses to things than I've had before to the quite extreme.
I think you made a great point, Sam, which was like that you just have to be on the lookout for deviations from your norm. Like, just being able to pick up signs of like, that's different. That was weird. Like my reaction in traffic, like, what the fuck was that? Or my response to my partner or child, like, what was that? Like, that's not me. That's not me moment. Like,
and to not normalize it. That's the thing. It's like we shouldn't go from, I'm a carefree, happy medical student to, I'm a downtrodden, cynical, tired, grumpy first-year doctor, and go, that's okay, that's normal. Because not everyone, that's not everyone's experience. It's most people's experience. So to some extent it is normal, but we shouldn't normalize it. So, the thing is to go, actually, I can do something about that. Or, and the step before that is, well, I need to do something about that. So if someone's listening at this point, we're going to post a link for them to go through a self-assessment tool. I think that's really important. I would encourage everyone to do that tool, because as I said, for me, it was so insidious, and it was so, it came on so gradually that I was an expert in it. I still didn't know I was in it. So I'd encourage everyone to go through a tool.
It's really good. Like I also did it a few weeks ago and was shocked. Like it's called the Copenhagen Burnout Index, and it's like scientifically validated and used in research. And I think it's open source and everything and free, but it's just like, it really did blow my mind going through these questions and realizing like, oh shit, like these things are still happening. And even though like we're doing an interview about burnout, we just did a webinar on burnout, and like, you just really sometimes need either an objective person, aka a psychologist, or an objective checklist to take stock of your situation.
Especially if things are going bad, or especially if things are going well. That's the interesting thing. Things are going great for you. Things are going great for me, in terms of work and meaning and family, but, this is a danger of passionate people throwing themselves into things, isn't it?
Yeah, it almost makes you wonder if like, it should almost be mandatory for like people in high risk jobs should be doing like a minimum 6-monthly Copenhagen Burnout Index or something similar. The problem is, I won't go into it too deep, but like there's ulterior motives between large employers and individuals. And I think it just like individuals want to bury their head in the sand, so do institutions sometimes. When I say sometimes, I mean a lot of the time, almost all the time.
So to anyone listening, we'll provide the link, but it might be something that you just set up a reminder every 3 or 6 months. Just do it, and then what I'd encourage is keep a record of it, because again, the trend is important. And so if something's trending in the wrong direction, there's another piece of data to go, that you don't have to kind of self-identify. You can go, hang on a second, this is going, because I don't remember how I felt 6 months ago, but I can look at I did the Copenhagen and I can see that it's trending in the wrong directions.
I did it a few weeks ago and it was a wake-up call for me, and I decided, I restructured my life. I made big restructurings in how I'm going to live my life, and it can have massive potency doing these quizzes or whatever, because they give you a sudden insight into how are you going against the general population. And I think particularly healthcare workers, most of them score off the charts.
Of course we do. Clinical medicine's a tough job. The time, the hours, the emotional stress, and you combine that with this sort of conditioning that we have of, sacrifice everything for the patients, and then you combine the increasing levels of bureaucracy and administration and non-clinical workload. It's a recipe for challenge. And so, from our perspective, we're not here, as I said, to talk about the systemic changes, which are necessary, but we've had a good conversation about, what are some of those early signs? What are some of the later signs? What's something a doctor or a medical student could do to track it over time and to see if this is a problem? And so, for anyone listening right now, you might be thinking a number of things. I mean, the first, you might be feeling really great about yourself because you're one of the few who's thwarted it, and not in burnout. Another thought you might be having is, this is a disaster. This sounds exactly like me. What am I going to do? The sky's falling. Where should I be a doctor? But you might also be thinking, okay, great. At least I've identified that, I've heard something, and I can do something about it. And if you feel like the sky's falling because you do sound like you have burnout, which, firstly, you're not alone. Probably most people listening, do have it. I'd encourage you to reframe it to go from this is terrible, this is a disaster, to okay, this is good. At least I can make some changes now. And it's really convenient, but any level of change that you make early will be dwarfed by the levels of change you need to make if you leave it. That would be the piece I'd encourage you to think about if you're listening. Well, what would you want to leave people? Because I think that, the identification piece, we've definitely covered that off well. And the next one we're going to talk about, okay, right, what are we going to do about it?
I think that being happy and having a career in clinical medicine is possible. It's possible to have a great time seeing patients, working long hours, having cognitive and emotionally charged situations that are difficult. It's possible to have all those and be stimulated and happy. And that if you're not feeling well or you're feeling unhappy in the way that you're practicing medicine, there are concrete ways to restructure the way you're doing things to find that happiness and satisfaction in your work. But it's not easy. But it does take, with some conscious effort, you can have a happy career in medicine. You don't have to be another statistic. And I think that's, I want to see less statistics and more happy doctors. Or nurses or physios, because they are often very giving people who are performing such a vital role for society. And it's often the best ones that are lost. It's often the most compassionate, intelligent ones who give and are so passionate. Like Sam said, the passionate ones tend to be almost the inevitable burnouts. So I think if you're passionate about medicine, be passionate about creating a career for yourself that's sustainable, because patients need you, and don't throw yourself on the fire.
Yeah, I love that. And I think to add to that sentiment, it clearly doesn't happen automatically. So if 2 and 3 doctors are in burnout, then it's not an automatic thing. But as you said, you can learn these skills. So whether you're at early stage burnout or not even in burnout, the next call we're going to talk about what you can do about it, and actually how you can set yourself up from a mind, body, work, support network perspective, so that you can thrive in medicine. I mean, I think that's got to be what we normalize, is energized, happy doctors who can process the really tough stuff that we're going to, because we're not going to change the fact that medicine is one of the toughest jobs, but we can actually be people who can process it in a healthy way. So we still, I was talking to a Dr. Fiona Wood, who is the Australian of the Year, and she left me with something that really I found profound. She's like, always leave some of the best of you for those who mean the most of you to you. And so that's the cool thing, is we can actually be people who can give a lot to our patients, but still have a lot for ourselves and the people we care about. And I think that's exciting, and I think that's what we should normalize.